So previous lecture we have looked at the determinants of working capital, the first 2 points. We are looking at what are the reasons, what are the different factors which help us decide how much working capital will be required in the business. Do we need lesser working capital? Do we need to be prepared with a higher level or more working capital? All that is decided by certain factors, and factors such as what type of business you are into, the general nature itself of the business, whether you are a service industry or like a service company, or you are into trading and manufacturing, that will decide how much working capital you require, because that will be based on the type of inventory you need, amount of inventory you need, the type of sales that you do, whether cash or credit. And secondly, what is the length of your production cycle? How much time does it take for your raw materials to get converted into finished goods? Because the longer the production cycle, the more will be the requirement of working capital. Because the cash which is stuck, which has been, which has been invested in the raw materials, it will not get quickly converted into finished goods. Like it will not come back into the business too soon, which is why production cycle is very important, and it decides the amount of working capital that may be possibly required. Alright. Now, the third point that we are going to look at is business cycle. Now, we have seen production cycle, how the production of raw material moves from one stage to another. In a similar manner, there is something called a business cycle. What it means is, any business at any given point of time, I'm not talking about a product life cycle, we're talking about a business. So when we run a business, at any point of time, depending upon how the market conditions are, depending on how the economy is doing, that business will go through different stages, right? Like if we put it in the form of a graph, you have this thing called a peak stage, right? Peak or boom, as we call it in business terms. This is the point where the business is at its best level, it's at its highest level. Sales are very high, there is a lot of demand for the product of that particular business, they're doing well, economy is also doing well, people have money in their hands, people have income in their hands, there is good employment, so there is enough cash and they invest, they purchase products, they purchase goods, and that business also tends to be in a very good condition. It tends to be at a very good stage of its life cycle. Okay. Then there is also something called a decline stage, or we also call it recession, right? That point where the sales start falling, there is not enough demand for the product, there is isn't enough employment and enough income also in the hands of the people. So you feel that recession stage, or that the extreme stage is called, of course, depression, right? Now recession would be when there is a lot of inflation, prices are increasing, people don't have enough cash to spend on things, businesses don't get enough sales, don't get enough demand, right? So the sales start falling, and then at some point there is a recovery stage. So like say for example, the lockdown last year since March, due to COVID, that led to a sort of a recession type of phase for businesses, because they were shut for so long, there was no demand, and then gradually now we can see that they are sort of in a recovery stage, and they're trying to pick up their business all over again. Okay, so businesses move in these different phases, all right, the upward phase or the peak phase, and then there is the declining or the downsizing phase. Okay, now in the peak phase there will be a lot of sales. All right, now if we try to picture it like this, peak phase, certain characteristics would be sales will be higher, that means receivables will also be higher, you will have a lot of debtors, right? Also your raw material requirement will be high, because the sale is so much, you have to increase your production, and to increase production you also require a very high amount of raw materials, okay? And you're going to make a lot of investment in raw materials, you're going to pay more salaries to your employees, you're going to employ more people and so on. So in this phase, your working capital requirement is also quite a lot, okay? A lot of working capital is required to meet all of these requirements, high raw material, high everything. In the down phase or the decline phase, on the other hand, your sales have fallen, the entire sales volume has gone down, you're not making enough sales, so there is no point in too much production as well, because otherwise you're going to waste all the raw material and the inventory is also going to fall. So less requirement of inventory or raw material, alright, and your, of course, your debtors or receivables will also be lesser. So what happens is, you don't have enough working capital in your hands at that point of time. Working capital levels are very low, they are very less because of the phase that you are in that particular, at that particular time, okay? So seasons like these different phases or stages that a business cycle moves, or a business moves from one to another, that is also responsible, or that also decides how much working capital you will possibly need in the business, okay? So that was the third point. The fourth point, the fourth determinant is seasonal operations of the business. Now, every business, well, most businesses, they will have a certain time of the year, or a certain phase throughout their lifetime where they will have extremely high uh, business, or their operations will be at a very high level during that time of the year, okay? So in some cases production is very high during the peak seasons, isn't it? Like for example, in Goa, your places like the shacks or all types of tourist destinations, they see a peak, or they see a lot of business during certain times of the year, during certain seasons. Like for example, starting from October or November going up to, let's say, April, May, that is known to be a peak season for tourism in Goa, right? And similarly, other businesses, like say for example, the sale of fans, coolers, ACs is again going to be very high during summer time, isn't it? At the same time, you will have things like raincoats and winter jackets that will sell only during a particular time of the year. Fine. Now, seasonal operations not just mean operations changing with actual seasons. It does not always have to do with summer, winter, rains, etc. It may also mean a sudden rise in the operations of a business because of some factor that is playing around. Like for example, say you have an event that is happening in Goa, say you have sunburn happening in Goa, right? So because of that event, a lot of tourists, they're flocking, you have a lot of people coming in, and gradually, of course, as a result of that, definitely the other types of tourism businesses are also going to flourish. So sunburn is not really literally a climatic condition or a season, but still it's a phenomenon that is creating sudden increase in the operations of those tourism businesses. All right. So working capital requirement will also differ depending upon these seasonal operations. So again, in the peak season, in that particular season, your working capital requirement will be very high. For example, those who are manufacturing ACs and fans, they are going to need a lot more working capital and raw material during particular seasons where the demand is very high for them. Okay, and during those off seasons, fine, this is during the peak, and during the off seasons when there's not as much business, working capital requirement will also be lesser. Why? Because production is less. The companies are not producing the same quantities, they don't require the same levels of raw materials, which is why the working capital requirement also goes down during those seasons. Fine. So again, seasonal operations is how or what determines the amount of working capital that will be needed in your businesses. Moving on to the next point, we have the credit policy of an organization. Now, first of all, what does credit policy mean? Businesses, when they buy or sell, they normally do it on credit. Like a lot of transactions of theirs happen on credit. Okay, that means when you buy something or you sell a product, you don't pay or receive cash immediately, right? If you are selling to a customer, you may give the customer some time to pay you the money, right? Especially industries, manufacturing industries, big industries, they really work based on credit sales. They don't do all cash business, right? Part of the payment may be made in cash, and sometime 2 months, 3 months, and so on is allowed to the other party to make the payment. Similarly, when your business is buying from someone, you may also ask for a credit period. You may also ask your seller, your supplier, to give you a few months to make the payment for whatever purchases you have made, right? So in that case, this becomes the credit policy. Your credit policy will be how much time you give your customers. Your supplier's credit policy will be how much time your supplier gives you in order to make the payment for the goods. Right? Now, if say for example, your sales follow a very lenient credit policy, that means you have a lot of credit sales, right? Then what happens? You are allowing a lot of time to your customers to make the payment in the future, fine? Which means you have a lot of debtors. All your customers are now become debtors because they have to pay you a certain amount of money, fine? In that case, your working capital requirement will also be very high. Why? Because you have made sales on credit, you have still not recovered the cash from your debtors, which means for a long time you will not get that cash back, and you will have to find working capital from other sources. You will have to borrow from banks or from somebody else, right, and arrange for that working capital. At the same time, say your purchases are on credit. That means your supplier is allowing you a lot of credit purchases. Okay, so credit purchases are very high in this case, and you are getting a lot of time to make payment, right? In that case, what happens? You have a lot of money in hand, because let's say you are supposed to pay 10,000 for some goods you have purchased from your suppliers. Now you don't have to pay the 10,000 today itself. You have 3 months time, correct? So what happens? For those 3 months, you get to use that 10,000 in whatever other way you require. Fine? So for that reason, your working capital requirement will also be less, because you have money in your hand. You don't have to pay your suppliers immediately. Your working capital needs have been met, right? And you don't need to raise extra working capital by approaching other sources of working capital. Fine. So in this case, the type of credit policy you follow for your customers, as well as the type of policy your suppliers follow while they deal with you, that will determine what or how much working capital is needed by the business at any given point of time. Okay, so those were that was the fifth point, based on the type of credit policy that businesses follow. The next point we have is growth and expansion of a business. Okay, now growth and expansion normally needs a lot of fixed capital. If you are, let's say, trying to set up a new shop, a new branch, another sister concern, or you feel like you need to set up a new factory, you're growing your business, or you are introducing a new product to your entire product line, right? So for these, or for this particular phenomenon, you require a lot of fixed capital, that is for sure. To buy that new factory, to buy the new shop, to buy all the new machinery required, a fixed capital will be required. At the same time, you will also need working capital for growth and expansion, because you can't do everything with fixed capital, isn't it? If you are, let's say for example, Borker Superstores, let's say they start a new store, fine, a new store somewhere close by in another locality. Now, they will need fixed capital in order to buy that store, correct? And all the other machinery, like let's say the computers in that store, the softwares, then all those other machines like barcode readers. For all these, they will require fixed capital. But at the same time, their new store will require new employees, isn't it? And new employees will need new salaries or more salaries. Then they will also require stock for that new store, correct? They will also need to meet some other day-to-day expenses, like let's say if the store is rented, or some other utilities like electricity, water, all of this, right? So for growth and expansion, when a business tries to grow into a bigger business, or it tries to expand into other types of businesses, it requires both. It needs fixed capital for sure, okay? At the same time, it requires working capital as well. So if you are a growing business, if you are a business that tries to do new things every now and then, tries to increase your sale, makes effort to increase your sale, then in that case, you require a lot of working capital in the business, okay? Even if like you feel like adding another counter, you feel like you're getting a lot of customers, and one additional counter has to be introduced in your superstore. So for that additional counter, you will need an additional employee also, right? And you will need to pay salaries, additional salaries to that employee. So any sort of growth, any expansion of a business that takes place requires a certain level of working capital. So this again decides the amount of working capital that we are going to need within the business. Okay, and the last 2 points that we will discuss, just another 2 points to go. We have availability of raw material, a very important point as to how the raw material is available to you and how much is available to you. Okay, now sometimes certain raw materials, like let's say especially agricultural products, okay, agro products, take in Goa itself, okay, cashews or mangoes as agricultural products are very popular, right? And they get used a lot, they're processed, they're canned and preserved, and they are sold overseas as well, they are exported. So all of these products, they're agricultural products. At the same time, they're also seasonal, which means that they are not available throughout the year, they are not produced throughout the year, right? And they're produced only during certain times, or harvested during certain times of the year, fine? So say for example, if raw material, any type of raw material is not available throughout the year, it is not available regularly every month and every season, then what happens? You have to purchase stock of that raw material and you have to store it in advance, right? Like cashews will not grow throughout the year. There will be certain seasons when they grow the most, isn't it? So in that case, you will have to harvest, you will have to buy all the raw material of cashews during that season itself and keep it, because it will not be available later. All right. Now what happens is, let's say you are harvesting the cashews somewhere in the month of March or April, okay? and you know that you will get most of your stock in these 2 months itself. Fine. But what if you don't have enough cash to purchase the stock during those months? The stock is available, the stock is in abundance, but you don't have enough cash. Like you have a certain shortage of cash during those months, isn't it? So in that case, you are going to need a lot of working capital. You're going to need to borrow a lot of cash, going to need to bring in a lot of capital in order to purchase your stock during those 2 months. Other times of the year, you may not need so much cash because you have cash, but the stock is not available. The stock is not present, it's not there, right? It's not in supply. But in these months, suddenly, when there is such a bumper harvest of those materials and you need to buy them, you may not have the necessary cash required. Okay, so working capital requirement will be very high when the stock is available, and it may not be so high, or lesser working capital will be needed when the stock is not in supply or it is not available. Okay, yes. And lastly, the last point that determines or decides how much working capital we are going to utilize or need in the business is operating efficiency. Now, what does efficiency mean? Making best utilization of something, right? You're said to be efficient. Like say for example, you're said to be time efficient when you make the best use of that time, right? Or if you're, let's say, if you're driving a car or you're driving a bike, you are said to be fuel efficient if you're making the best use of that fuel, isn't it? If you ride or drive within that economy, economy speed. There's something called economy speed for bikes and cars. Like within 40 or anything between 40 to 50 or 55 is economy speed. So you're going at a speed where you are not utilizing too much of the fuel. So you're said to be fuel efficient, or the car is said to be fuel efficient if it is making best use of that fuel. Same way, efficiency here, the operating efficiency, would mean how best resources, operations are managed within the business. Okay, like for example, you cannot control prices of your raw materials, isn't it? If the suppliers are quoting a certain price, if all are quoting similar prices and it's very high for you, you can't do much about it. You need to carry on production, so you have to buy those raw materials at whatever price is made available, correct? But what can you do to make sure that you don't increase your requirement of working capital? You can make the best use of that raw material. Make sure your wastages are reduced, right? Make sure your scrap is reduced. Okay, make sure that your products are not spoiled or damaged in the case of production while production is going on, and that you don't have to scrap it every now and then, isn't it? So that would be inefficient. If you want to reduce your requirement of working capital, you have to make the best use of the raw material, the finished goods that you have produced. Alright? At the same time, certain operations like cash collection, you have to be very good at this. Okay? Say you have given 3 months time for your customers to make payment to you for the goods that you have sold them. Okay, now make sure that they really pay you in those 3 months time. Give them reminders, tell them every now and then that they need to make payment within this much time. If you are too relaxed, and if your operations, if your management is least bothered about making the collection, then those customers will also be least bothered to actually make the payment, right? So your efficiency depends on what efforts you put in order to collect that cash from your customers, right? And the better policies you have for cash collection, again, lesser will be your working capital requirement. Why? Because the cash is going to come into your business in time, and you will not need to borrow extra working capital to run your business. So those were all the points on what determines working capital. We have about 8 points over here, and very simple points related to the nature, related to the type of operations, the type of seasons that a business goes through as a result of its operations.